for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Ant-Man and the Wasp, the 2018 sequel to the 2015 movie Ant-Man, and the overall 20th installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Which sounds really weird, because this is a movie that's coming out sometime after Avengers Infinity War, the movie that the entire cinematic universe has been building up to that point, and yet you decide to release this movie that takes place sometime before Infinity War, but release it sometime after Infinity War. I just find it to be really odd. Like, I think that Infinity War should have been the 20th installment of the franchise as opposed to Ant-Man and the Wasp. But anywho, I will admit that out of the three MCU movies that were coming out in the year 2018, Ant-Man and the Wasp was the one I looked forward to the least, because with something like Black Panther, that was a comic book character I always wanted to see on the big screen for some time. And with Avengers Infinity War, the entire MCU, like I said earlier, was building up to this moment, so that took even higher priority. And with something like Ant-Man and the Wasp, it basically turned into the MCU movie I look forward to the least of the MCU movies that were coming out in the year 2018 by default. Not because I thought the movie looked bad or anything, because when I saw the trailer, I'm like, okay, this looks fun, but it looks like they're doing a lot of the same stuff that they did in the first Ant-Man movie, so I wasn't really as hyped to see this movie as much as something like Black Panther or Avengers Infinity War. And yeah, that's really about it, which leads me to my big question. Is Ant-Man and the Wasp a good follow-up to Ant-Man? Actually, correction, Captain America Civil War, because as for the plot of this movie, set sometime after the events of Captain America Civil War, Scott Lang, now under house arrest because of his involvement in the Civil War between Captain America and Iron Man, tries to rebalance his life yet again. However, things get complicated when Hope and her dad, Dr. Hank Pym, show up with a brand new mission that revolves around Scott, Hope, and Dr. Pym exploring the quantum realm. Thus, Scott Lang must suit up as Ant-Man once again. This time, however, he isn't alone, as he is joined by Hope Van Dyne, who takes up the mantle of the Wasp. Scott Lang and Hope begin their mission of discovering the secrets behind the quantum realm, as the two of them battle a phase-shifting supervillain known as the Ghost. In terms of what I liked about the movie, much like any other movie set within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Ant-Man and the Wasp has good production value, from having good CGI, regardless if it's used when the two eponymous heroes grow or shrink, having the villains phase through solid objects, having characters exploring the quantum realm. Even the CGI ants featured in this movie look 20 times better than the ants featured in the first Ant-Man movie. Because even though the ants featured in the first Ant-Man movie looked pretty good, there are just as many ants that looked very unconvincing because of how unpolished the CGI looked on them. Whereas the ants in this Ant-Man movie look like they actually have a lot more detail added to them. Going back to the costume design, I think that the costumes that our eponymous heroes wear throughout the movie are really good. Starting with Ant-Man's costume, because it goes back to the costume design that was seen in the first movie as opposed to the costume design seen in Captain America Civil War, which I have a problem with, but I'll talk about that later. And I actually do like the fact that they make some slight changes to it, where the red is a lot more brighter in some areas. As far as the costume design for Wasp, on the other hand, or in this case, both the Janet Van Dyne Wasp and the Hope Van Dyne Wasp, I think they cover a good spectrum with the costume designs they have for each incarnation of the Wasp character, because Wasp herself in the comics is one of those comic characters that goes through a lot of costume redesigns. And I do think that the costume designs for both Janet Van Dyne and Hope Van Dyne they choose represent the Wasp character well here, where Janet Van Dyne's Wasp costume looks very reminiscent of the Wasp costume that she wore in the 1960s, whereas the Wasp costume that Hope Van Dyne wears is very reminiscent to that of the type of costume you see Wasp wear during the early thousands. Even Hank Pym dons a costume at one point that I'm not sure if it was meant to be like a reference to one of his earliest costumes, but it kind of looks like a retro take on his classic costume, which I thought was pretty cool. Then you have the overall costume design for the villain Ghost in the movie, which looks like a mixture of various costume designs that the Ghost character has worn in the comics, where it has some features like the hood that the original Ghost design had during the late 1980s, but also has some other features very reminiscent to that of the Ghost costume you see in the current Marvel comics. I also like the cinematography in the movie. I think it's well done in terms of how some things are shot. I also like how the movie continues the themes that were established in the first Ant-Man movie, like having the focus on family and passing the torch from one generation to another. However, instead of focusing on Scott Lang and having him try to reconnect with his family and becoming the next Ant-Man, it's more focused on Hope Van Dyne trying to further her relationship with her father, Hank Pym, but also becoming the second incarnation of the Wasp, as she and her father try to reunite with her mother, Janet Van Dyne, the original Wasp. Hell, even this idea is sort of extended to the relationship between Ghost and Bill Foster. Actually, the more I think about it, other than having the recurring themes of family and passing the torch from one generation to another, the Ant-Man movies also have this recurring motif of having strong father-daughter relationships, with the first and big one being Scott Lang with his daughter Cassie, Dr. Hank Pym with his daughter Hope, and Bill Foster with Ghost. Kinda. I'll explain their relationship in a few minutes, however, you get my point. I also like the direction that the story goes in, because a lot of problems that a lot of sequels have is the fact that they basically tell the same story that the first movie told, albeit this movie does retread certain moments from the original movie, but as far as the actual story itself goes, it's completely different from the original, because with the original movie, it was a heist movie. Like, if I had to describe the first Ant-Man movie, it's like a cross between Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Ocean's 11. With Ant-Man and the Wasp, on the other hand, within the first few minutes of the movie, we see Scott Lang, while under house arrest, playing with his daughter, doing a pretend heist mission, telling the audience early on that Ant-Man and the Wasp is not gonna be another heist movie. Instead, Ant-Man and the Wasp is a chase movie, and I think that within the context of the Ant-Man movies, this feels like a natural progression for the Ant-Man mythos set within the MCU. Because I view the Scott Lang incarnation of Ant-Man as being the modern-day take on the innocent man on the run. And for those of you who don't know what the innocent man on the run type story is, it's essentially when the main character gets caught up in this situation where he is in some shape or form framed for something he did do and tries to prove his innocence as he's being chased by opposing forces, regardless if it's the antagonistic force that frames him in the first place, like maybe a group of gangsters to foreign agents, or even domestic ones like the local police to the FBI. A popular story archetype that Alfred Hitchcock would use in his movies. Granted, Scott Lang himself isn't completely innocent because he is a cab burglar after all, but he still does indeed fulfill that archetype, in that sense where in the first movie, when he's recruited by Dr. Hank Pym and Hope, the police are after him. With Ant-Man and the Wasp, on the other hand, he's being chased by both the FBI and some black market criminals. Another aspect to this movie that I liked revolves around the fact that this movie gives an answer to a question that I didn't even ask. That question being, does Scott Lang actually have full access to the Ant-Man suit? Because throughout the majority of the first Ant-Man movie, we see that Hank Pym has passed the title of Ant-Man on to Scott Lang, but we never see Hank Pym give full ownership of the Ant-Man suit to Scott Lang. And the fact that Scott Lang used the Ant-Man suit during the events of Captain America Civil War has repercussions for him. And not only does this affect Scott Lang, this also affects both Hank Pym and Hope Van Dyne, because Scott Lang used the Ant-Man suit without Hank Pym's permission. And this forces both Hank Pym and Hope Van Dyne to go into hiding while being chased by the FBI. And what makes this aspect of the movie even cooler is the fact that it really shows the impact of some of the larger scale movies like Captain America Civil War has on some of the smaller scale movies like this. I also like how the movie goes about Hope Van Dyne becoming the new incarnation of the Wasp, in that sense of we actually don't see it happen, because from the very beginning of the movie, Hope Van Dyne is the Wasp. Now, what do I mean by this exactly? Allow me to compare the Hope Van Dyne character to another MCU character, James Rhodes, aka War Machine. Because when these two characters first appeared in their first initial appearance, with Hope Van Dyne appearing in Ant-Man and with Colonel Rhodes appearing in the first Iron Man movie, we get a general gist of who they are as characters. And we get to see the relationship that they have with our main hero. And near the end of the movie, there is a hint that these characters will become superheroes at some point in the future. Now, fast forward to the next installment of the franchise in which both these characters become their respective alter egos, and this is where things start to take a different turn in terms of how these characters become their respective alter egos. Starting with James Rhodes becoming War Machine, because in Iron Man 2, at the start of the movie, he's just himself. Then at some point in the middle of the movie, he dons one of the Iron Man armors, clearly has no idea how to use it, and we see him go through trial and error of operating said armor while he's fighting against a intoxicated Tony, proceeds to take the armor and have Justin Hammer make modifications to it, thus becoming War Machine. With Hope Van Dyne becoming Wasp on the other hand, basically, when the movie first starts, we just see Hope Van Dyne as herself, but then maybe several minutes later, we see her as the Wasp, without any of the bullshit that you would see in between. And I really appreciate that, because on one hand, I do feel that the filmmakers could have so easily had an entire montage sequence of having Hope Van Dyne try on the suit, go through trial and error in terms of how it functions. Instead, they did the smart thing of, you already know this character, we already had scenes like that with the first Ant-Man movie, we're just gonna skip that and just show Hope Van Dyne kick ass as the new Wasp, which I think works really well for the movie's advantage. Another two aspects of the movie that I liked both revolve around the quantum realm. The first being the fact that in this movie, we get to explore more of it, because in the first Ant-Man movie, we were introduced to the quantum realm, but we didn't really explore much of it. With Ant-Man and the Wasp, on the other hand, it went in the direction that made logical sense for the Ant-Man movies, that being the characters exploring the quantum realm. As for the second aspect of the quantum realm that I liked, revolves around the visual aesthetic. Because my biggest worry going into this movie in regards to the quantum realm was the fact that the visual aesthetics were going to look too similar to the type of visual aesthetics we've seen in something like Doctor Strange. However, Marvel has found a way to actually make the quantum realm different from the weird cosmic dimensions that we're seeing in something like Doctor Strange. And before I go any further, just as a side tangent, I do like how when we do get to explore the quantum realm, we have a chance to see some microorganisms, like water bears. Because I can't think of any other science fiction movie that has ever introduced a microorganism like the water bear, which I thought was really cool to see in a science fiction movie like this. But anywho, another aspect of this movie that I liked is the fact that this movie didn't repeat the Cassie Lane plot device from the first movie, because during the climax of the first Ant-Man movie, the main villain of Yellow Jacket takes Cassie Lane as a hostage in order to get to Scott Lane. In this movie, it almost looks as if they were about to repeat that plot point, because there is a point in time where Ghost comes up with this idea of getting to Scott Lang by kidnapping his daughter. And as she's about to do so, Bill Foster steps in and says something along the lines of, I know you've done a lot of bad shit that I'm willing to turn a blind eye to, but kidnap that girl or touch her hair in her head, I ain't helping you. And sure enough, they don't repeat that plot point. And the last thing I liked about this movie is the way this movie ends, because the movie actually comes to an end. Now, what do I mean by this? With the first Ant-Man movie, I wasn't really the biggest fan of the way it ended, since I felt it went on just a little bit too long in some cases. Like, if I had to make a few adjustments to that ending, I just would have had it end at Scott Lang eating breakfast with his daughter, ex-wife, her husband, along with a giant ant, and then have the scene of Scott Lang talking to Lewis be a mid to post-credit scene. I only say that because the part where you have Scott Lang talking to Lewis feels tacked on. It doesn't really feel like a proper conclusion to the movie. With Ant-Man and the Wasp, on the other hand, after the climax, we have the fall in action, we see the characters hang out with one another, and the movie ends on a happy note with Scott, Hope, and Cassie watching the giant killer ant movie, Them. And as far as I'm concerned, I thought that was the best way to end the movie. As for the next aspect of the movie, I have mixed feelings towards the Ghost character. Because if you go back to my review of the original Ant-Man movie, one of my biggest problems with that movie revolved around the Yellow Jacket character, because not only is the MCU incarnation of Yellow Jacket nothing like its comic book counterpart, but the concept behind Yellow Jacket as the main villain of that movie is just yet another evil doppelganger of the main hero. Now granted, I get that Ant-Man doesn't have the best rogues gallery in the world, but I feel like they could have done something different with the villain. Like instead doing a evil doppelganger type character, I stated that they should have used either one of 6 villains. 2 of them being the Ant-Man villains, Whirlwind and Radioactive Man. The other 2 being pre-existing characters that showed up in the Phase 1 MCU movies, just in Hammer and the Abomination. And 2 random villains that had nothing to do with Ant-Man, one of them being Taskmaster and the other one being Ghost. Now, fast forward several years later, when Ant-Man and the Wasp is in production, with the announcement that Ghost was going to be a major character in the movie, let's just say I was a tad bit surprised, because I didn't really think a obscure supervillain like Ghost would make an appearance in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Then again, if supervillains like Coldblood and Ego the Living Planet appear in the MCU as villains, I guess anything's possible. That being said, the Ghost that appears in this movie is really different from the comic book counterpart, because the Ghost that appears in the comics is typically a villain to Iron Man, who is a man that in some shape or form gained the ability to phase through solid objects and became this paranoid hacker. As for the movie incarnation of Ghost, she is basically the phase through equivalent of Ivan Vanko from Iron Man 2. Now, what do I mean by this? In Iron Man 2, the main villain is Ivan Vanko. Now, in the comics, he's not an actual character. He was essentially made up for the movie, but the filmmakers took inspiration from 2 different Iron Man villains, one of them being the costumes villain Whiplash, and the other one being the Russian Iron Man knockoff Crimson Dynamo, and combined the 2 together to create a new villain in the form of Ivan Vanko. And as a nice bonus, Ivan Vanko's father is Anton Vanko, who was the first incarnation of Crimson Dynamo. With Ghost, on the other hand, the filmmakers went in a completely different direction with the character, where they take the overall costume design and power set from the comics, but they change up the actual character itself, because we now have a character that went from being a male of unknown origin who became this paranoid hacker. We instead get a woman named Ava Starr, who turned out to be the daughter of longtime Ant-Man villain Elias Starr, aka Egghead. And having Ava Starr be the daughter of Elias Starr, I thought was a nice touch, since Elias Starr is an arch nemesis to Hank Pym. And as for Ava Starr's origin in terms of how she becomes Ghost, her father essentially tried to do an experiment revolved around the quantum realm using stolen tech from Hank Pym, and the experiment goes wrong, killing both him and his wife, leaving their daughter alive, but being affected by the experiment, giving her these phasing powers, giving us the MCU incarnation of Ghost. And in terms of what I liked about the character, I like her motivation, because when you look at the motivations to some of the other villains in the MCU, it usually comes down to one of 3 things. It's either I want to make money, take over the world, or destroy the universe. With Ava, on the other hand, she's basically the MCU equivalent of Captain Barbossa from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, where you have this character that's given this extraordinary power, which in some ways is both a blessing, but also a curse. And all Ava wants to do in this movie is to rid herself of this power and just become a regular person again. And I find that to be refreshing. I also like how the movie's theme of father-daughter relationships continues with this character as well, because even though her father's dead, she does end up having this daughter-father relationship with one of the other characters being Bill Foster. And despite not being an actual father-daughter duo, you do see how much Bill Foster and Ava Starr care for one another through the way they interact with each other. I even like the way they handled Ghost's phasing ability in this movie, because going into this movie, I was kind of wondering, how would you make Ghost's ability to phase through solid objects different from that of Vision? And sure enough, the filmmakers found a way to really alter Ghost's phasing ability in a way that's different from Vision's, whereas Vision has full control of his powers and gains it through the Mind Stone. Ghost, as I said earlier, got her powers through the quantum realm and doesn't have much control over said powers. And when she does use them, it kind of leaves these cool after images of the character walking through solid objects, which I thought was pretty cool to see in a visual sense. Now onto the problems that I have with the character. Even though I like the character conceptually speaking, I think they could have done more with Ghost, because as she sits, I like her motivation. I just wish there was more to it, where maybe the longer she uses her powers, maybe bits of her body start to disappear, or maybe bits of her personality disappear along with her, making her more dangerous. Also, within the context of the movie, Belle Foster tells Ava that she only has a few weeks to live, yet the way the movie treats it, it almost sounds like Ava has a few hours or days left to live as opposed to a few weeks. And maybe change her relationship up just a little bit to give more emotional connection to one of the other characters that I'll talk about later. And this leads directly into the problems I have with the movie, starting with the villains of the movie, because this movie is confused as to who the main villain is. Now, what do I mean by this? When you look at the advertising to the movie, regardless if it's the trailers or the posters, Ghost looks like she's going to be the main villain of the movie. Yet, when you watch the movie, she does serve as an antagonistic force towards Ant-Man and Wasp, but she's not the main villain of the movie. Ghost is just a partner to Bill Foster, and he's not the main villain of the movie. And if Ghost and Bill Foster aren't the main villains in the movie, then who is the main villain? Like, the closest thing I could think of was the black market dealer Sonny Butch, because he's the one that causes the most amount of problems for our heroes. And even then, I didn't think Sonny Butch was all that interesting of a villain. Sure, the actor playing him I thought was great. I just didn't like the character of Sonny Butch. Because at the end of the day, Sonny Butch is just a greedy businessman who wants to make money. And we've already seen this type of character before in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I'm sick of seeing it. And on top of that, really? Sonny Butch is gonna be a villain in this? Like, I get that you want to introduce, like, the criminal underworld into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is fine, but I feel like he could have had a better choice in villain, like Owl, Hammerhead, Silvermane, Black Tarantula. Just someone that wasn't Sonny Butch. As for the next few problems I have with the movie, in some shape or form revolve around Scott Lang's character. The first problem being the lack of a dilemma Scott Lang has as a character. Because in any second installment of a superhero movie, the main hero always goes through some sort of dilemma. With Peter Parker in Spider-Man 2, his dilemma is, can I really still be Spider-Man without the superpowers? With Bruce Wayne in The Dark Knight, his dilemma is, does Gotham really need Batman when it has Harvey Dent? And so on and so forth. Scott Lang doesn't have a dilemma in this movie. Or if he does have one, it's not an emotional dilemma. It's more of a physical dilemma of, shit, I need to get back to the apartment before FBI agent Jimmy Woo discovers I'm not there anymore. The other problem that I have with Scott Lang in this movie is the way the movie treats him. Because this movie is called Ant-Man, and Scott Lang is the main character of the Ant-Man franchise within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yet the movie doesn't treat him like a main character. Instead, the movie treats Scott Lang like a comical relief character. Now sure, Scott Lang, in his 2 appearances before this movie, has had some comical moments, but Scott Lang himself is not comical relief. And to add on top of that, during those first 2/3, Scott Lang is depicted as being this incompetent dumbass, which really contrasts with his character from the previous 2 appearances. Because in the first movie, Scott Lang, although he's nowhere near as intelligent as Hank Pym, is shown to be crafty in his own way. And when it came to using the Ant-Man suit in the first movie, sure, he was incompetent because he didn't know how the suit operated. And by the time we see Scott Lang in Captain America Civil War, we see that he's a lot more competent using the Ant-Man suit during the airport battle. With Scott Lang in this movie, he is shown to be incompetent and useless as all hell, because the Ant-Man suit he wears in this movie is a brand new prototype that malfunctions throughout the entire movie. And I feel like this was done intentionally to show how much more competent Hope is using the Wasp suit as opposed to Scott Lang using the Ant-Man suit. And if that's the case, it's also not a bad idea. I think they just could have gone about it in a much better way. Although the movie does redeem itself by having Scott Lang be both more competent using the Ant-Man suit and be more helpful during the last third of the movie. Another problem I have with the movie actually has nothing to do with this movie, but Ant-Man's previous appearance in Captain America Civil War. And it revolves around his costume design, because you look at the Ant-Man costume in the first Ant-Man movie and this movie, they look identical. Yet the Ant-Man suit featured in Captain America Civil War vaguely looked like the Ant-Man suit that appeared in the first Ant-Man movie, but it's not the same costume. And here lies the problem. Because the Ant-Man costumes that appeared in the first Ant-Man movie and Captain America Civil War look totally different, but they're supposed to be the same costume, and they don't look anything alike. Now, I could understand that maybe if the Ant-Man costume that appeared in Captain America Civil War appeared in this movie as the prototype, that would make more sense, but it doesn't. because at some point later in the movie, we clearly see both the old and new Ant-Man suits in this movie, and they look identical. So, in reality, it's actually not a problem with the movie, it's more the problem with the continuity that's established within this movie, as far as costume design is concerned. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around Ava Starr, because as I mentioned before, I like the character conceptually speaking, but I felt that maybe the execution of her emotional connection could have been a lot better, because as it is, I do like the fact that she does have a beef with Hank Pym for getting her father, Elias Starr, fired and destroying his scientific reputation, but I think it could have been pushed a bit further beyond that. Like, would it have been cool if maybe Ava Starr and Hope Van Dyne were really close childhood friends, but were separated because Hank Pym fired Elias Starr from S.H.I.E.L.D.? Then you have the events of Elias Starr trying to do the experiment, which leads to his eventual death, and Ava's exposure to the quantum realm, giving her these phasing powers. Then you fast forward to Ava in the present day, and she's at that point in her life where she's losing her body both physically and mentally, and when she encounters Hope Van Dyne for the first time in forever, maybe Hope Van Dyne recognizes Ava Starr, but maybe Ava Starr doesn't recognize her due to memory loss of her powers, giving Ava Starr a more tragic emotional connection to Hope Van Dyne. And why I would make this change for Ava's character, because in the movie, you have two characters who are being affected by the quantum realm in some shape or form, with Janet Van Dyne being trapped in the quantum realm while Ava Starr is losing her physical body to the realm itself. And as it sits, we have an emotional connection to Janet Van Dyne because she's the mother to Hope Van Dyne and the husband to Hank Pym, but no emotional connection to Ava. And I feel like this could have been a point in time where maybe Hope had to make a tough decision in regards to who should be saved, her mother or her childhood best friend. As it sits, it's a very one-sided decision where it's like, oh, I'm going to save the person that's trapped in the quantum realm as opposed to this one person who is affected by it, but I got no emotional connection to said person. That would have made things interesting if Ava Starr did have this tragic emotional connection to Hope Van Dyne. And speaking of Janet Van Dyne, I found Janet Van Dyne's psychic connection with Scott Lang to be really weird, because in this movie, it's established that when Scott Lang was temporarily trapped within the quantum realm back in the first movie, Janet Van Dyne came up to him and implanted a psychic link between herself and Scott Lang during his brief time in the quantum realm, using him as a conduit not only to communicate with Hank and Hope, but to guide him towards her safely. And I just found this aspect of the movie to be really weird. Like, having Janet Van Dyne insert a psychic link into Scott Lang is one thing, but there's literally a point in time where Janet Van Dyne possesses the body of Scott Lang and uses him as a puppet in order to interact with Hank and Hope. And I just found this part of the movie to be really weird and out of place for a movie like this. Another problem that I have with this movie is the sense of humor this movie has this time around. Because in the first Ant-Man movie, it was very comedic in tone, and most of the jokes landed with me, although I could have done without the Lewis character because he's comical relief in a movie that's already comical to begin with. The jokes that are presented in the first half of this movie are actually really funny, since not only do they have good setup and good payoff, but in some shape or form, they contribute to the story. Like, the joke that got the most laughs out of me revolves around Scott Lang telling Hank Pym that he destroyed the original Ant-Man suit. And I'm not going to reveal what happens around this point in time because there is a good payoff to it, but this was the joke that got me the most amount of laughs. But by the time you get to the second half of the movie, the jokes just go downhill, since there's no good build-up, no good payoff, and they're so irrelevant that you literally could have removed these jokes from the movie and nothing would be missed. Like, the joke I literally could have done without is the stupid line of dialogue coming from Scott Lang's ex-wife, who says the following words: "What does FBI stand for? Forever bothering individuals." That I just could have done without, and this joke in particular just made me cringe the most. I'm not sure why, but it did. So, in short, I think the humor in this movie could have been toned back just a little bit. Another problem that I have with the movie is the advertising, because the trailers show too much of the movie. At least a lot of the cool action sequences. Hell, the second trailer spoils one of the mid to post-credit scenes of the movie. And I just find that to be embarrassing because the last time a superhero movie spoiled one of its own mid to post credit scenes was the 2012 The Amazing Spider-Man movie. And I'm so surprised that Marvel Studios would actually allow one of these trailers to spoil one of the mid to post credit scenes. Because ever since Iron Man came out in 2008, the general movie-going audience has shown interest in watching these movies, making it an event. But on top of that, not only do people watch these movies, but they also sit through the credits to see the mid to post-credit scenes, which in and of itself has become an event to see what they're teasing for the next movie. And as for the last problem that I have with the movie has to do with the final battle. Because as it sits, I don't think the final battle in this movie is terrible by any means, since there is definitely some fun set pieces, but I think the final battle that occurs in this movie, I think would have made for a better mid-action sequence as opposed to the final battle. Because as I sat there watching the movie, I was just like, really? This is the final battle? I just felt very underwhelmed by it. So for my final verdict of Ant-Man and the Wasp, I have mixed feelings towards the movie, because on one hand, it does everything that a movie sequel should do by having a story that's different from the first movie, further exploring the concepts and mythos that were established in the previous movie, and taking problems that I had with the first movie and fixing them to make them better in this movie. However, I do feel that the movie is lagging in several other areas, like actually having a story that matters, a central villain, and have several gags throughout the movie that felt very unneeded. And I think that out of all of the movies to come out of the Phase 3 lineup of the MCU, this is by far the weakest film of the bunch, because with something like Doctor Strange and Black Panther, even though I'm not the biggest fan of those movies, I still think they're pretty good, introduce new concepts and have stories that matter to the overall MCU, and have very different types of stories. Whereas Doctor Strange is a supernatural adventure, Black Panther is a very politically heavy drama. Ant-Man and the Wasp in comparison is just your standard superhero sequel. Nothing more, nothing less. So overall, Ant-Man and the Wasp I still think is a good movie, just perhaps one of the weakest installments of the Phase 3 lineup that acts as nothing but harmless filler until the next big MCU movie. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Ant-Man and the Wasp? So it looks like the movie's been getting really good reception, surprisingly. And so for my final rating of Ant-Man and the Wasp, I give it a 3 out of 5. So with Ant-Man and the Wasp being the last of the MCU movies to come out in 2018, and with the Marvel Cinematic Universe turning 10 as of 2018, what MCU movie do you think is the best, the worst, most over-recommended, and most under-recommended? And see you later.